The deep ocean is exceptional at keeping secrets. When a state-of-the-art commercial airliner vanishes without a trace, without a mayday call, and without any radar returns, the aviation world is thrown into a profound crisis of faith. On the morning of June 1, 2009, this nightmare became a reality when Air France Flight 447 disappeared over the equatorial Atlantic, taking 228 souls with it. For 2 agonizing years, the wreckage lay nearly 4,000 meters below the surface, locking away the answers to how a modern marvel of engineering could simply fall out of the sky. When the flight data recorders were finally recovered from the abyssal plain, the truth they revealed was far more chilling than a bomb, a catastrophic structural failure, or a massive storm. It was a tragedy born in the liminal space between human cognition and complex automation, a fatal breakdown in communication, not just between the pilots, but between the pilots and the machine they trusted with their lives. To understand the cascading failures that doomed Flight 447, we must go back to a warm evening in South America, where a trap was quietly waiting in the dark. On the night of May 31, 2009, at Rio de Janeiro's Galeão International Airport, passengers were boarding Air France Flight 447 for a routine overnight transatlantic journey to Paris. Their aircraft was an Airbus A330-200, registered as F-GZCP. Barely 4 years old, the jet was a gleaming example of Airbus's core design philosophy, the fly-by-wire system. In a traditional aircraft, the pilot's control column is physically connected to the flight control surfaces via cables and pulleys. But in the A330, when a pilot moves their side stick, they are merely sending an electronic request to a battery of flight control computers. These computers analyze the request, compare it against the laws of aerodynamics, and then command hydraulic actuators to move the ailerons, elevators, and rudder. The fundamental goal of this system is safety. The computers operate under what Airbus calls normal law, a set of hard-coded protections that physically prevent the pilot from making control inputs that could stall the aircraft, overstress the airframe, or cause it to enter a dangerous bank or pitch angle. It is a system designed to save pilots from themselves. Commanding the flight that night was 58-year-old Captain Marc Dubois, a highly respected veteran with nearly 11,000 flight hours, including 1,700 on the A330. Because the flight from Rio to Paris was scheduled to take over 11 hours, regulations required a 3-pilot crew to allow for rotated rest periods. Joining Dubois were 2 co-pilots, 37-year-old First Officer David Robert, an experienced aviator with 6,500 hours, and 32-year-old First Officer Pierre-Cédric Bonin. Bonin, with 2,900 flight hours, was the least experienced of the 3, and his career had been spent almost entirely in the highly automated cockpits of modern fly-by-wire Airbus aircraft. At 22:29 local time, 01:29 UTC on June 1st, F-GZCP lifted off the runway and pointed its nose toward the Atlantic Ocean. As the lights of the Brazilian coast faded behind them, the cockpit was enveloped in the inky blackness of a moonless night over the open sea. Without a visible horizon, the pilots were entirely reliant on their instrument panels for spatial orientation. Their route directly intersected the Intertropical Convergence Zone, ITCZ, a notorious band of weather near the equator where trade winds from the northern and southern hemispheres collide. Sailors historically called it the Doldrums, but for aviators, it is a formidable wall of towering cumulonimbus clouds, fueled by updrafts that suck warm, moist air deep into the stratosphere. By 01:55 UTC, the A330 was cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet, flight level 350. Following the crew's designated rest schedule, Captain Dubois left the left seat to take his break in the crew rest bunk behind the cockpit. He left First Officer Bonin in the right seat as the pilot flying, PF, while First Officer Robert took the left seat as the pilot monitoring, PM, responsible for radio communications and overseeing the flight systems. On their weather radar, the pilots could see bright red and magenta blooms, indicating heavy precipitation and active storm cores ahead. But airborne weather radar has a critical limitation. It works by bouncing radio waves off water droplets. What it cannot see clearly are areas saturated with tiny, supercooled ice crystals that gather in the upper anvils of these massive storm systems. At 0208 UTC, looking at the radar display, Robert suggested a slight heading change to the left to avoid the worst of the weather returns. Bonin dialed in the heading, and the A330 gently banked left. Neither of them realized that this minor deviation was steering them away from the visible rain and directly into a massive, invisible cloud of high-altitude ice crystals. Outside the cockpit windows, the temperature was a bitter minus 40 degrees Celsius. A microscopic physical failure was about to strip away the aircraft's electronic armor, leaving two startled pilots to fight a battle they didn't know they were in. To navigate the pitch-black sky, an aircraft relies on a mechanical nervous system called the pitot system. Protruding from the nose of the Airbus A330 are three small L-shaped metal tubes known as pitot probes. As the aircraft pushes through the sky, ram air enters the open front of these tubes. By comparing the dynamic pressure of this ram air against the static pressure of the undisturbed air outside, the aircraft's computers calculate the indicated airspeed, IAS, the single most vital metric for keeping an airplane aloft. But the pitot tubes on F-GZCP were manufactured by Thales, and specifically, they were the Thales AA standard. Air France, along with Airbus and safety regulators, was already aware of a troubling flaw with this specific model. When flying through high concentrations of supercooled ice crystals at high altitudes, the probe's internal heating elements could be overwhelmed. The ice would accumulate, freeze over the inlet hole, and effectively blind the aircraft. Air France was actively in the process of replacing these probes across its fleet with a more robust model, but F-GZCP had not yet been upgraded. At exactly 0210:05 UTC, as the A330 glided into the invisible heart of the storm cell, millions of supercooled ice crystals slammed into the three pitot tubes. The heaters failed to keep up. In a matter of seconds, all three tubes iced over completely. Inside the tubes, the trapped air pressure rapidly dropped. On the flight deck, the pilot's airspeed indicators plummeted inexplicably from a healthy cruise speed of 275 knots down to a dangerously low 60 knots, and then to zero. The A330's flight control computers, the FMGECs, are incredibly sophisticated, but they operate on strict, unforgiving logic. They constantly cross-reference the data from the three pitot tubes. When the computers saw the airspeed drop so drastically and impossibly fast, they determined that the data was invalid. The logic dictates a fail-safe response. If I do not know how fast we are flying, I cannot guarantee I can fly the plane safely. Therefore, I must give control back to the humans. Instantly, the autopilot disengaged. The autothrust, which manages engine power, also disconnected. A loud, piercing alarm known as the cavalry charge echoed through the cockpit, signaling the loss of autopilot. Simultaneously, the master caution lights illuminated and the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor (ECAM) screen in front of the pilots began rapidly scrolling through a cascade of system failures. Crucially, because the computers could no longer trust the airspeed, they downgraded the aircraft's operating software from normal law to alternate law. In normal law, an Airbus protects the crew from themselves. It will not allow a pilot to pitch the nose up so high that the wings lose lift, a stall, nor will it let the aircraft bank too steeply or fly too fast. But in alternate law, these electronic guardrails are stripped away. The aircraft flies like a conventional, older generation airplane. If a pilot commands a pitch up that would cause a fatal stall, the computer will no longer stop them. The pilots of Flight 447 were suddenly thrust from a state of quiet, automated cruising into a jarring sensory overload. This sudden transition from relaxation to severe cognitive demand triggers what aviation psychologists call the startle effect. The brain, bombarded by flashing lights, blaring alarms, and sudden turbulence, temporarily bypasses logical processing and reverts to raw, instinctual reactions. First Officer Pierre-Cédric Bonin, sitting in the right seat, grabbed his side stick. Because the autopilot had disconnected while they were in slight turbulence, the plane had begun to roll gently to the right. Bonin instinctively corrected the roll by moving his stick to the left. But then, he did something that would seal the fate of everyone on board. He pulled back on the side stick, commanding the nose of the heavy airliner to pitch up. Why did Bonin pull back? Accident investigators theorize that without a visible horizon, the sudden deceleration caused by the loss of autothrust, combined with the turbulence, induced a physiological phenomenon known as a somatogravic illusion. His inner ear falsely told his brain that the aircraft was pitching down into a dive. To counteract this terrifying sensation of falling, his instinct was to pull the nose up. Furthermore, the A330 was now in alternate law. In normal law, moving the stick back slightly at high altitude might just tell the computer to maintain a gentle climb. But in alternate law, pulling the stick back translates to a direct, proportional command to the elevators to pitch the nose up aggressively. Within seconds, the massive A330 pitched up to an angle of 11 degrees, an extraordinarily steep climb for an airliner at 35,000 feet. The aircraft began to rocket upward at a rate of 7,000 feet per minute. In the left seat, First Officer David Robert was desperately trying to read the scrolling ECAM messages to understand what systems they had lost. "We've lost the speeds," he called out, diagnosing the initial pitot tube failure. But Robert had no idea what Bonin was doing with his right hand. This brings us to a controversial design feature of Airbus aircraft. In a Boeing airliner, the pilot control columns, yokes, are physically linked. If the captain pulls back, the first officer's yoke moves back too, providing immediate tactile and visual feedback. But the side sticks in an Airbus are asynchronous. They are not mechanically connected to each other. Because Robert was looking at the instrument panel, he could not see that Bonin was holding his side stick in a continuous nose-up position. As the A330 zoomed upward, it was trading kinetic energy, speed, for potential energy, altitude. At 38,000 feet, the air is dangerously thin. An aircraft requires a tremendous amount of forward speed to generate enough lift over the wings to stay airborne in that thin air. By pitching the nose up so steeply, Bonin was rapidly bleeding off their airspeed. At 0 to 1051, the aerodynamic limits of the wings were breached. The airflow over the top of the wings began to separate into turbulent eddies. Lift rapidly decayed. A synthetic voice pierced the clamor of the cockpit, accompanied by a harsh, cricket-like tone. "Stall! Stall!" It was the most dire warning an aviator can hear. The aircraft was warning them that it was losing its grip on the sky. The only aerodynamic recovery for a high-altitude stall is to push the nose down immediately to regain airspeed and reattach the airflow over the wings. But in the dark, overwhelmed by alarms and deceived by his own senses, Bonin did not push the nose down. He kept pulling back. Less than a minute after the supercooled ice crystals overwhelmed the Thales pitot tubes, the crisis that initiated the emergency resolved itself. The ambient friction and the internal heaters melted the ice. The pitot tubes cleared, and valid airspeed data returned to the pilot's primary flight displays. Had First Officer Bonin simply taken his hand off the side stick during that chaotic first minute, the Airbus A330's inherent aerodynamic stability would have kept it flying straight and level. They would have experienced a brief, terrifying cacophony of alarms, but the aircraft would have been perfectly fine. But aviation is a realm where human perception can be lethally distorted by fear and disorientation. Driven by the Somatogravic Illusion and the overwhelming Startle Effect, Bonin had continuously pulled back on the stick. The aircraft had surged from 35,000 feet to an apex of 38,000 feet, bleeding off its kinetic energy with every foot it climbed into the thinning atmosphere. To understand what happened next, we must understand the concept of angle of attack, AOA. This is the angle between the wing's chord line, the imaginary line from the leading edge to the trailing edge, and the relative wind, the direction the air is hitting the plane. If a pilot pulls the nose up too high, the angle of attack becomes too steep. The smooth airflow traveling over the top of the wing separates, creating a turbulent, swirling wake. When this happens, the wing stops generating lift. The aircraft is stalled. By 02:11:10 UTC, Flight 447 had reached its peak altitude and practically stopped moving forward. With its nose pitched up at an astonishing 16 degrees, the 200-ton airliner began to plummet toward the ocean. It was not diving nose first. Rather, it was falling belly flat, dropping like a stone with a staggering vertical descent rate of over 10,000 feet per minute. In the left seat, First Officer Robert was completely baffled. He was looking at his altimeter spinning backward at a terrifying rate, but the artificial horizon showed the nose was pointing up. It made no sense. "What is happening?" he asked frantically. "I don't know. We're going down," Bonin replied, his voice tight with panic. And then, the Airbus flight control computers made a logical decision that would seal the fate of everyone on board. It was a quirk of software engineering, a line of code written by designers who never imagined an airliner could find itself in this specific, extreme aerodynamic state. The A330 measures its angle of attack using small vanes on the side of the fuselage. For these vanes to provide accurate readings, there must be a sufficient flow of air moving past them. Airbus engineers decided that if the aircraft's forward airspeed dropped below 60 knots, about 111 kilometers per hour, the airflow was too slow to be reliable. The computer was programmed to assume that any speed below 60 knots meant the aircraft was either taxiing on the ground or the data was completely invalid. As Flight 447 fell in a deep stall, its forward airspeed, not its vertical drop speed but its forward momentum, dropped below that critical 60-knot threshold. The computers looked at the data. Airspeed is below 60 knots. Therefore, the angle of attack data is invalid. Therefore, the stall warning is no longer reliable. Instantly, the synthetic voice shouting, "Stall! Stall!" abruptly silenced. The cockpit was still filled with other chimes and warnings, but the most critical alarm, the one telling them they were falling out of the sky, had turned itself off. This created a catastrophic perverse reinforcement loop in Pierre-Cédric Bonin's mind. He was still holding the stick all the way back. The stall warning was silent. To his panicked brain, holding the stick back meant safety. A few times during the agonizing 3-minute descent, Bonin instinctively relaxed his grip on the stick, or pushed it forward slightly. When he did this, the nose of the A330 dropped a few degrees. This caused the aircraft to pick up a tiny bit of forward speed. As soon as the forward speed crossed back above the 60-knot threshold, the computers recognized the angle of attack data as valid again. And because the aircraft was still massively stalled, the alarm violently roared back to life. "Stall! Stall!" Terrified by the sudden return of the blaring alarm, Bonin immediately yanked the side stick back again. The speed dropped below 60 knots, the data became invalid, and the alarm fell silent. Without realizing it, the software logic had conditioned the pilot to do exactly the wrong thing. Pushing forward on the stick, the only action that could save their lives, triggered a deafening alarm. Pulling back, the action that was killing them, rewarded him with silence. The basic laws of aerodynamics had been completely inverted by a flaw in the warning logic. At 02:11:40, 1 minute and 30 seconds after the autopilot disconnected, the cockpit door burst open. Captain Marc Dubois rushed in, having been awoken by the violent turbulence and the faint sound of alarms penetrating the bulkheads. He stepped into a nightmare. The cockpit was illuminated by a Christmas tree of red and amber warning lights. "What the hell is happening?" Dubois demanded, standing behind the two co-pilots. "We've lost control of the plane!" Robert yelled. "We don't understand anything! We've tried everything!" Dubois leaned forward, scanning the instruments. He saw the altimeter unwinding. He saw the extreme pitch. As an experienced aviator, the pieces should have fallen into place. But Dubois was missing the single most crucial piece of the puzzle. Because the Airbus side sticks are asynchronous, Dubois could not see that his first officer, sitting right in front of him, had the control stick buried full aft in his lap. The captain was trying to diagnose a dying aircraft, completely unaware that the man flying it was the one holding the gun. The Airbus A330 was now falling out of the sky at a staggering rate of 10,000 feet per minute. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was one of sheer, unadulterated confusion. 3 highly trained professionals were looking at the same instruments, but none of them could construct a mental model of reality that made sense. Captain Marc Dubois stood behind his 2 first officers, his eyes darting across the instrument panels. He saw that the aircraft was descending rapidly, yet the pitch attitude on the artificial horizon showed the nose was pointed up. To an experienced pilot, a high nose and a rapid descent mean only one thing: a deep aerodynamic stall. But Dubois could not see what First Officer Pierre-Cédric Bonin was doing with his right hand. Because the Airbus side sticks are asynchronous, meaning they move independently and do not provide visual or tactile feedback to the other pilot, Dubois had no way of knowing that Bonin was holding his stick fully aft, continuously commanding the fatal pitch up. At 02:13:40, the aircraft plummeted through 10,000 feet. The thick, warm air of the lower atmosphere began to rush past the fuselage, but it was not enough to restore lift to the stalled wings. Suddenly, a new, terrifying voice joined the cacophony in the cockpit. It was the Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, sensing the rapidly approaching ocean surface. "Sink rate! Pull up! Pull up!" First Officer David Robert, sitting in the left seat, was desperately trying to find a solution. He pushed his own side stick forward, trying to lower the nose to regain speed. But Airbus computers average the inputs from both sticks if they are moved simultaneously. Because Bonin was pulling fully back on the right and Robert was pushing forward on the left, their commands canceled each other out. A mechanical voice coldly announced, "Dual input." At 02:14:23, passing through 4,000 feet, Robert yelled, "Climb! Climb! Climb! Climb!" It was in this desperate, chaotic moment that Bonin finally uttered the words that unlocked the mystery of the last 3 minutes. It was a tragic, fatal confession. "But I've had the stick all the way back for a while." Behind them, Captain Dubois froze. The impossible puzzle instantly clicked into place. The captain finally understood why the aircraft was stalled and why it wouldn't recover. "No, no, no, don't climb!" Dubois shouted. "Go down!" Robert echoed, finally realizing what his colleague had been doing. "Give me the controls! Give me the controls!" Bonin let go of his stick. Robert shoved his side stick fully forward. The nose of the massive A330 finally began to drop. The airspeed began to build as gravity pulled them downward. But physics is an unforgiving master, and altitude is a pilot's only currency when recovering from a stall. To break a deep stall in a heavy airliner and regain flying speed, a pilot needs tens of thousands of feet of empty sky to dive into. Flight 447 had less than 2,000 feet left. The ocean was rushing up to meet them in the darkness. At 02:14:28 UTC, the cockpit voice recorder captured the final, terrifying sounds of the impact. The Airbus A330 slammed belly first into the surface of the Atlantic Ocean at a speed of 152 knots, about 175 miles per hour, with its nose pitched up at 16.2 degrees. The immense force of the water instantly destroyed the aircraft, killing all 228 passengers and crew on board. It took 2 years and tens of millions of dollars to locate the wreckage in the abyssal depths of the Atlantic and retrieve the black boxes. When the French Civil Aviation Safety Authority, BEA, finally published its exhaustive final report, the findings sent shockwaves through the global aviation industry. The investigators did not simply point the finger at pilot error. Instead, they exposed a systemic failure that sat at the dangerous intersection of human psychology, automated aircraft design, and airline training paradigms. The tragedy of Air France Flight 447 changed commercial aviation forever. The hardware. The Thales AA pitot tubes, which were highly susceptible to icing from supercooled crystals, were universally banned for high-altitude commercial flights. Airlines worldwide were mandated to replace them with more robust designs, primarily manufactured by Goodrich. The software logic. Airbus fundamentally altered the logic of the stall warning system. A patch was rolled out ensuring that if an aircraft is airborne, the stall warning will never silence itself simply because the forward airspeed drops below a certain threshold. The perverse psychological trap that tricked Bonin into pulling back was eliminated. The training revolution. This was the most profound change. The industry realized that modern pilots had become system managers, heavily reliant on automation, and had lost touch with basic stick and rudder flying skills, especially at high altitudes. Regulators globally mandated upset prevention and recovery training, UPRT. Pilots are now regularly placed into simulators stripped of their autopilot and flight envelope protections and forced to manually recover from high-altitude stalls. Most importantly, the crash reinforced the most sacred fundamental rule of aviation, one that should supersede all computer screens and confusing alarms. When the airspeed is unreliable and the instruments are contradictory, pilots must revert to pitch and power. By manually setting a specific pitch angle, where the nose points, and a specific engine power setting, an aircraft will continue to fly safely, regardless of what the computers or alarms are screaming. The pilots of Air France 447 did not intend to destroy their aircraft. They fought bravely until the very last second. But they were fighting a battle in the dark, betrayed by failing sensors, a confusing cockpit interface, a deeply flawed software logic, and an industry that had failed to prepare them for the day the computers gave up. Today, the skies are measurably safer because of the hard lessons extracted from the cold depths of the Atlantic. The 228 souls who perished in the equatorial doldrums left behind a legacy that ensures pilots will never again be left so fundamentally unprepared when the automation fails and the night closes in.